The empath who learned to fight back. Everyone was shocked. While analyzing Jung's personal journals from his most intense research period, scholars discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about sensitive people. Jung secretly documented what he called empathic shadow integration, the explosive moment when someone who spent their life absorbing everyone else's pain suddenly learns to turn that sensitivity into their greatest weapon. What shocked Jung most wasn't that this transformation was possible, but how dramatically it changed every relationship in these people's lives. Back in the early 1900s, Jung kept encountering the same type of patient in his practice, individuals who seemed to carry the emotional weight of everyone around them. These weren't just sensitive people, they were human emotional barometers who could walk into a room and immediately sense tension, sadness, anger, or fear that others couldn't even detect. Jung initially thought these patients were suffering from what he termed psychic permeability, an inability to maintain proper psychological boundaries. But Jung noticed something incredible happening during his analytical sessions. As these highly sensitive individuals began to understand their own psychological patterns, they weren't just learning to protect themselves from emotional overwhelm, they were developing what Jung described as empathic mastery, the ability to use their heightened emotional awareness as a strategic advantage in every area of their lives. One patient walked into Jung's office completely defeated after years of being the family peacemaker, constantly mediating between explosive relatives while their own needs went completely ignored. This person had spent decades reading micro-expressions, predicting emotional outbursts, and adjusting their behavior to manage everyone else's feelings. Jung realized this wasn't weakness, it was intensive psychological training that had created an almost supernatural ability to understand human motivation and behavioral patterns. Through their analytical work together, this patient began to see their empathy differently. Instead of automatically absorbing and taking responsibility for others' emotions, they started consciously observing and strategically responding to them. The transformation was so dramatic that family members who had taken this person for granted for years suddenly found themselves unable to manipulate or guilt-trip them anymore. The patient had learned to weaponize their sensitivity. Jung documented case after case of this same pattern. Highly empathic individuals who had been emotional doormats their entire lives were discovering they possessed what Jung called shadow empathy, the ability to see through emotional manipulation, predict behavioral patterns, and influence outcomes by understanding people's deepest psychological drivers. These weren't just people who felt everything, they were people who understood everything about human nature because they'd been forced to study it for survival. What fascinated Jung most was how these transformations shocked everyone in these patients' lives. Family members who had relied on their empathic relative to absorb dysfunction suddenly faced someone who could call out their patterns with surgical precision. Romantic partners who had exploited their empathic lovers' people-pleasing tendencies found themselves dealing with someone who could read their manipulation tactics like an open book and respond accordingly. Modern neuroscience research at institutions like Harvard and MIT is now proving Jung was decades ahead of his time. Brain imaging studies show that highly empathic individuals have dramatically enhanced activity in regions responsible for emotional processing, social cognition, and behavioral prediction. What Jung observed clinically, we can now see scientifically. Empaths aren't just feeling more, they're processing vastly more complex emotional and social information than the average person. Dr. Helen Rees at Harvard Medical School has demonstrated that empathic individuals show increased neural connectivity between brain regions that process emotions and those that analyze social situations. This means empaths are literally wired to understand human behavior at levels most people can't access. They're not too sensitive. They're operating with enhanced emotional intelligence hardware. Recent studies at Stanford's Social Neuroscience Lab reveal that trained empaths can predict behavioral outcomes with accuracy rates that seem almost supernatural. They can detect deception, identify emotional triggers, and anticipate relationship dynamics with precision that rivals trained psychologists. The key difference Jung identified is that most empaths never learn to use these abilities strategically. They just suffer under the weight of all that emotional information. Here's what Jung understood that we're just beginning to appreciate. Empaths who learn to consciously direct their abilities don't just become better at managing their own emotions, They become psychological strategists who can navigate any social situation, influence any outcome, and protect themselves from any form of emotional manipulation. They transform from victims of their sensitivity into masters of human psychology. Look, if you've made it this far in this discussion, you're probably recognizing patterns from your own life. You've likely spent years feeling like you're carrying everyone else's emotional baggage, wondering why you can't just toughen up like other people suggest. You might have been told you're too sensitive or that you feel too much. But what if Jung was right? What if every difficult emotional experience you've endured has been building your psychological database? Jung's research suggests that empaths develop what he called emotional archaeology, the ability to excavate the deeper psychological reasons behind people's surface behaviors. Every time someone has taken advantage of your kindness, you've learned exactly how that manipulation tactic works. Every time you've absorbed someone else's anxiety or anger, you've studied those emotional patterns from the inside out. Every boundary you've failed to maintain has taught you precisely why boundaries matter and how to recognize when they're being tested. Jung's observations about empathic individuals are being validated by cutting-edge research in multiple fields. Neuroscientists at the University of California have discovered that people with heightened empathy show increased gray matter density in brain regions associated with emotional processing and social cognition. This isn't just about feeling more, it's about having enhanced neural architecture for understanding human behavior. Dr. Tanya Singer's research at the Max Planck Institute demonstrates that empathic individuals can be trained to distinguish between emotional contagion, absorbing others' emotions, and cognitive empathy, understanding others' emotions without taking them on. This distinction is crucial because it's the difference between being overwhelmed by empathy and being empowered by it. Jung intuited this difference decades before we had the technology to prove it. Studies in social psychology show that highly empathic people consistently outperform others in reading nonverbal cues, detecting deception, and predicting behavioral changes. They excel at identifying what psychologists call micro-expressions, fleeting facial expressions that reveal true emotions beneath conscious attempts to hide them. This isn't mystical intuition, it's enhanced pattern recognition developed through intensive real-world training. The fascinating part is that empaths often don't realize they possess these abilities because they've been conditioned to see their sensitivity as a liability rather than an asset. Jung found that once his empathic patients understood the psychological mechanics of their abilities, they could consciously develop and direct them. Instead of being passive recipients of emotional information, they became active analysts and strategists. Jung documented how empaths who learned to harness their abilities developed what he termed empathic authority, a quiet confidence that comes from understanding human nature at profound levels. These individuals couldn't be easily manipulated because they could spot manipulation tactics instantly. They excelled in negotiations because they could read underlying motivations and emotional triggers. They built stronger relationships because they understood what people truly needed versus what they claimed to want. Research in organizational psychology confirms Jung's observations. Studies show that leaders with high empathy combined with strong boundaries consistently outperform those who lack either trait. They create more engaged teams, navigate conflicts more effectively, and build more sustainable organizational cultures. The key is learning to use empathy strategically rather than being overwhelmed by it. Contemporary neuroscience reveals that empaths can literally see emotional patterns that others miss. Their brains process subtle social cues that register below most people's conscious awareness. This gives them access to information that can be incredibly powerful when used intentionally. Jung recognized that empaths who learned to trust and direct this information became formidable psychological strategists. What Jung found most remarkable was how this transformation affected empaths' relationships. Instead of attracting people who wanted to exploit their emotional availability, they began attracting individuals who appreciated their depth and insight. Instead of being everyone's emotional dumping ground, they became trusted advisors who could offer genuine wisdom about human nature and relationship dynamics. If you're someone who's always been told you're too emotional or overly sensitive, Jung's research suggests you might actually be operating with enhanced psychological hardware that most people don't possess. The question isn't whether you should become less sensitive. It's whether you're ready to learn how to use that sensitivity as the strategic advantage Jung knew it could be. Jung's empathic transformation patterns are everywhere once you know what to look for, playing out in distinctly American contexts that would have fascinated him. Consider what happens in corporate America when an empath finally learns to weaponize their people-reading abilities. Take the classic scenario of someone who spent years being the office emotional support system. They're the person everyone comes to with their problems, the one who stays late to help struggling colleagues, the individual who can sense office tensions before anyone else even notices them. For years, this person might feel drained and undervalued, watching less empathic colleagues get promoted while their emotional labor goes unrecognized. But when an empath applies Jung's principles of shadow integration, everything changes. They start using their ability to read micro-expressions and energy shifts strategically. In meetings, they can tell when someone is lying about project timelines, when leadership is unhappy with proposals, or when colleagues are planning to throw them under the bus. Instead of absorbing this information passively, they start responding proactively. They begin calling out passive-aggressive behavior in real time. I'm sensing some frustration about this decision. Let's address what's really bothering you so we can move forward effectively. They stop doing emotional labor for colleagues who don't reciprocate. I can tell you're stressed about this presentation, but you'll need to manage that anxiety yourself or ask for specific help rather than just venting to me. The transformation shocks everyone because this person suddenly seems impossible to manipulate or exploit. Colleagues who used to dump their emotional baggage realize their favorite target has become psychologically bulletproof. Management recognizes someone who can read room dynamics and predict team conflicts before they escalate. Within months, this person often finds themselves in leadership roles because they understand human motivation better than anyone else in the organization. American family dynamics provide another perfect example of Jung's empathic inversion principle. Consider someone who grew up as the family mediator, constantly managing their parents' marriage problems, their siblings' jealousies, and extended family drama. This person learned to read emotional triggers, predict blow-ups, and adjust their behavior to keep peace at all costs. As adults, they often repeat these patterns, becoming the family emotional janitor who everyone depends on but no one truly appreciates. Jung's framework reveals how this same person can flip the script entirely. Instead of absorbing family dysfunction, they start analyzing it strategically. They recognize manipulation patterns, identify emotional blackmail tactics, and understand exactly which family members use drama to control others. Armed with this awareness, they can respond completely differently. When their dramatic sister calls with the latest crisis, instead of automatically jumping into rescue mode, they might say, "I can tell you're looking for emotional support, but I'm noticing this same pattern happening monthly. What are you planning to do differently this time?" When guilt-tripping relatives try to manipulate them into attending toxic family gatherings, they respond with, "I understand you want me there, but I also sense you're trying to make me responsible for other people's feelings about my absence, which isn't something I'm willing to take on." The family's shock at this transformation can be intense because the empathic family member has essentially refused to enable dysfunction anymore. Some relatives get angry because their favorite emotional dumping ground is no longer available, but others start relating more authentically because they can't rely on manipulation tactics anymore. American dating and relationship culture showcases Jung's empathic mastery principles beautifully. Empaths often struggle in romantic relationships because they can sense their partner's every mood shift, insecurity, and emotional need. They frequently end up in relationships with people who exploit this sensitivity, knowing the empath will absorb their emotional volatility and constantly adjust to accommodate their issues. But an empath who's learned Jung's shadow integration techniques becomes a completely different kind of romantic partner. They can still sense their partner's emotions, but instead of automatically taking responsibility for managing them, they respond strategically. They recognize love-bombing tactics, identify emotional manipulation attempts, and spot red flags that other people miss entirely. When dating, instead of ignoring gut feelings about someone's character, they trust their empathic insights. If they sense dishonesty, manipulative tendencies, or emotional immaturity, they address it directly rather than making excuses. They might say something like, I'm picking up on some inconsistencies between what you're saying and what I'm sensing from you energetically. Help me understand what's really going on. This level of emotional directness often shocks romantic partners who expect empaths to be pushovers. Some people can't handle dating someone who sees through their psychological strategies so clearly. But the right partners find this emotional intelligence incredibly attractive because it creates space for authentic, deep connection rather than surface-level game-playing. The transformation is particularly dramatic in how these empaths handle relationship conflicts. Instead of absorbing their partner's anger or anxiety, they might respond with, "I can feel how upset you are, and I want to understand what's driving this reaction. But I'm not going to take on responsibility for emotions that belong to you. Let's figure out how to address the actual issue here." Jung understood that empaths who master their abilities don't become cold or unfeeling. They become incredibly skilled at creating healthy emotional dynamics. They can offer genuine support without losing themselves, set boundaries without being cruel, and love deeply without being exploited. You're still here, which tells me you're recognizing these patterns in your own experiences. You've probably lived through some version of these scenarios, wondering why you always seem to end up managing other people's emotions while your own needs get ignored. But Jung's research suggests this hasn't been random suffering. It's been intensive training in human psychology that most people never receive. Jung's clinical observations suggest that empaths who successfully transform their sensitivity into strategic power follow specific psychological principles. Here's the framework that emerges from his work with empathic individuals. 1. Recognize your emotional intelligence expertise. The first step Jung identified is helping empaths understand they possess genuine psychological expertise developed through real-world experience. Every toxic relationship taught you manipulation tactics. Every family drama showed you emotional trigger patterns. Every workplace conflict revealed power dynamics. Instead of seeing these experiences as just pain you endured, recognize them as intensive training in human behavior that most people never receive. Start documenting what your empathy has taught you. Write down the manipulation strategies you've encountered, the emotional patterns you've learned to predict, and the behavioral triggers you can now spot instantly. This isn't about becoming cynical, it's about acknowledging your hard-earned expertise in human psychology. 2. Distinguish between empathy and emotional responsibility. Jung found that empaths struggle because they confuse feeling others' emotions with being responsible for managing those emotions. Healthy empathy means understanding what someone else is experiencing without automatically taking on the job of fixing it or making it better. Practice what Jung called empathic observation. Notice and understand others' emotional states without immediately jumping into action. When you sense someone's anxiety, instead of automatically trying to soothe them, observe that anxiety analytically. What's driving it? What does it tell you about their psychological state? How does it affect their decision-making? This shift from reactive empathy to strategic empathy changes everything. 3. Deploy your shadow empathy. Jung believed empaths develop what he termed shadow empathy, the ability to see the darker aspects of human nature that others miss or deny. This includes recognizing manipulation tactics, identifying hidden agendas, and understanding people's unconscious motivations. Most empaths suppress this ability because they've been taught it's negative or judgmental. Start trusting your darker insights about people. If you sense someone is being dishonest, don't ignore that feeling to be nice. If you detect manipulation attempts, acknowledge them consciously rather than pretending they're not happening. Your shadow empathy is one of your most powerful tools for psychological protection and strategic positioning. 4. Practice empathic aikido. Instead of absorbing emotional manipulation or trying to fight it directly, Jung's approach involves redirecting it back to its source. When someone tries to guilt-trip you, reflect their strategy back to them. I'm noticing you're trying to make me feel responsible for your disappointment. What's making that approach feel necessary for you right now? This technique accomplishes multiple things simultaneously. It stops the manipulation attempt, demonstrates your awareness of what's happening, and forces the other person to examine their own behavior. Most people have never had their manipulation tactics reflected back to them so clearly, which often stops the behavior immediately. 5. Establish empathic authority. Jung observed that transformed empaths develop what he called empathic authority, a quiet confidence that comes from understanding human nature at deep levels. This isn't about becoming cold or controlling, it's about positioning yourself as someone with genuine psychological insight rather than someone who's too sensitive. Start sharing your observations about human behavior and relationship dynamics. When you notice patterns others miss, point them out. When you predict how situations will unfold, voice those predictions. When you understand motivations that others don't see, offer those insights. Position yourself as someone with valuable perspective on human psychology, rather than someone who just feels a lot. 6. Curate your empathic environment. Jung found that empaths who master their abilities become very selective about their relationships and environments. They stop tolerating energy vampires, emotional manipulators, and psychologically unhealthy dynamics. This isn't about being antisocial. It's about recognizing that your empathic abilities are valuable resources that should be invested wisely. Audit your relationships and environments honestly. Which people consistently drain your energy without reciprocating? Which situations regularly overwhelm your empathic system? Which environments enhance your abilities versus those that deplete them? Start making strategic choices about where you invest your empathic energy. 7. Build your empathic network. Instead of trying to tone down your sensitivity to fit into relationships with less empathic people, Jung's approach involves finding others who operate at your level of emotional intelligence. This creates relationships based on mutual understanding rather than accommodation of psychological immaturity. Seek out people who appreciate depth, who can handle direct communication about emotions, and who don't exploit empathic individuals. These relationships become incredibly nourishing because you can be fully yourself without constantly managing someone else's discomfort with emotional honesty. 8. Integrate your empathic shadow. Jung's concept of shadow integration is crucial for empaths. You need to acknowledge and embrace the parts of empathy that society labels as negative. Your ability to see through people, your awareness of manipulation, your understanding of human weakness and selfishness. These aren't flaws to overcome. They're essential aspects of complete empathic mastery. Stop apologizing for seeing things others don't want to acknowledge. Stop pretending people are better than they actually are to make others comfortable. Stop suppressing your insights about human nature to maintain social harmony. Your shadow empathy is what protects you from being exploited and allows you to navigate the world strategically. The choice you're facing isn't whether to become less empathic. That's impossible and would diminish your greatest strength. The choice is whether you're ready to step into the psychological power Jung identified in empaths who refuse to stay victims of their own sensitivity. This transformation will shock people who've grown comfortable exploiting your emotional availability, but that's exactly how you'll know you're doing it right. Your empathy isn't a weakness to manage. It's a strategic advantage to master. Jung proved this is possible, and now it's time to prove it in your own life.